reasons why academics, different reasons I suppose, have also backed away from parrhesia. When I first began in 2003 to give somewhat hesitant public expression to my growing skepticism about the official accounts of what happened on 9/11, I was warned by a very dear friend, who's also a distinguished professor of American political science, not to touch the subject, any involvement with which would result in permanent damage to my academic reputation, such as it might be. Now, I didn't take this advice or the similar advice a little more than a year later of another friend who wanted to steer me away from publishing analyses of how the Bush Republicans had stolen the 2004 presidential election. As a textual scholar, Michael, what do you know about this? How are you going to invade the territory of political scientists? Well, if one does textual analysis, if one does critical thought, if one does careful, methodologically alert research, disciplinary boundaries don't mean anything. And it occurred to me to wonder what value there could be to markers of professional standing which served not to encourage, but to block inquiry into questions of historical truth and material reality. Or on the other hand, what claims to courage and integrity could be made by public intellectuals who fold their tents at the first mere threat of scurrilous handling by opponents. Now, I think it's worth asking ourselves how well the work of parrhesia has been done over the last, shall we say, 8 years. And there's a very interesting recent column by Glenn Greenwald at Salon.com, a searching meditation on the humbling fact that what he calls the transgressions and abuses of the Bush regime's 8 years in office were, quote, allowed to be unleashed with so little backlash and resistance. Just consider, with no hyperbole, says Greenwald, what our government, our country has done. We systematically tortured people in our custody using techniques approved at the highest levels, many of whom died as a result. We created secret prisons, black site gulags, beyond the reach of international monitoring groups. We abducted and imprisoned even U.S. citizens and legal residents without any trial, holding them incommunicado and without even the right to access lawyers for years while we tortured them to the point of insanity. We disappeared innocent people off the streets, sent them to countries where we knew they'd be tortured, and then closed off our courts to them once it was clear they had done nothing wrong. We adopted the very policies and techniques long considered to be the very definition of war crimes. Here's Greenwald still more. Our government turned the NSA apparatus inward, something that was never supposed to happen, spying on our conversations in secret and without warrants or oversight, all in violation of the law, and then once revealed, acted to immunize the private sector lawbreakers. And that's to say nothing about the hundreds of thousands of people we killed and the millions more we displaced with a war launched on false pretense, and on and on and on. I think I'd want to correct his figures a little bit. I believe the more accurate accounting of the number of dead due to the invasion of Iraq is more like 1.2 million at the moment. Now, Greenwald proposes that while prime responsibility for these actions may, quote, lie with the administration which implemented them and with the Congress that thereafter acquiesced to and even endorsed much of it, unquote, the blame for this largely unhampered criminality, quote, also lies with much of our opinion-making and expert class, unquote. So you can take those categories as meaning our journalists, our pundits, and also our academics, our think tank people, whatever they are. I don't really think of them usually as being academics, but people with some pretense to scholarly status. Greenwald again, quote, even when they politely disagreed, they treated much of this, and still do, as though it were reasonable and customary, eschewing strong language and emphatic condemnation and moral outrage, while perversely and self-servingly construing their constraint as some sort of virtue, a hallmark of, and he gives a capital S to this word, seriousness. Meanwhile, those who objected too strongly and in disrespectful tones, who described the extremism and the lawlessness taking place, were dismissed by these same elites as overheated fringe hysterics, unquote. Now, Greenwald's essay points to a widespread and dismal failure among a large part of what have sometimes been called the chattering classes, most particularly among those accredited and given platforms and audiences by the corporate media. But for salutary counter-evidence of a gathering wave of resistance to the official account of the event that above all served to legitimize the other crimes of the Bush administration, including the whole toxic system of its war on terror, one can turn to the website Patriots Question 9/11, which contains brief statements by some 1,500 people, including senior military and intelligence officers and government officials, pilots and aviation professionals, academics, among them distinguished scientists, as well as humanists and legal scholars, and some 600 architects and engineers. It's interesting, I don't check this site very, very frequently. The last time I looked at it, there were about 300 architects and engineers. Some 5 or 6 months later, that number had doubled. And these include, I mean, some of the architects and engineers are students of architecture, recent graduates in engineering. Some of them are people with 40 years experience, heads of companies, very senior people. We might well have to acknowledge that forms of behavior very much like those excoriated by Glenn Greenwald have been widespread in recent years among much of our own Canadian opinion-making and expert class, among whom serious criticism of the current orientation of Canadian foreign policy or of the immense damage done to our system of jurisprudence by anti-terror legislation and the ensuing violations of normal legality have all too often been met by scoffs or titters. We might, on the other hand, take some comfort in the fact that a healthy sprinkling of the questioners, the parrhesiastes, whose statements appear on that website, are Canadians. Notable among them, my Guelph colleague, fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the philosopher John McMurtry, the textual scholar and founding director of McMaster University's Institute for Peace Studies, Graham McQueen, the development economist and founding editor of the Global Research website, Michelle Chossudovsky, and the distinguished investigative journalist and media critic, Barry Zwicker. Now, we've slipped sideways into the subject of my talk this evening, Canada's role in the war on terror. I hope you can hear the scare quotes around that term, war on terror, because one of the very first things we need to do is to question and revise that phrase. President Bill Clinton was already talking in the 1990s about a war on terrorism, one product of which was, of course, his criminal cruise missile attack on Sudan's major pharmaceutical factory, which American intelligence had idiotically misidentified as a chemical weapons facility. Noam Chomsky has estimated that attack led indirectly over the next number of years to the probable deaths of some 10,000 Sudanese as a result of the medications that were no longer available in that country. But the contracted form of a war upon an abstract noun, a war which involved the fabrication of a largely mythical but quasi-state enemy, and legitimized an endless series of wars of aggression. You remember these statements of Rumsfeld and Cheney that this is a war that's going to go on for maybe a century. They said with obvious eagerness. Together with the deliberate demolition of all of the human and civil rights protections provided by the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights, that war on terror was the invention of the neoconservative ideologues who came to power in the George W. Bush regime with the judicial coup d'etat that overturned the actual results of the 2000 presidential election. That's something to remind ourselves of, that perversions of legality underlay the coming to power of these people. There's very good scholarship, conclusive scholarship, to show that George Bush was not elected in 2000. That the Democratic, that his opponent won both the popular vote Al Gore won the popular vote, and also